It was a quiet night in uptown Dallas, a neighborhood where crime rarely pierced the upscale facade of chic apartments and trendy restaurants. But tonight was different. At the Gables Park 17, an elite apartment complex, the hum of city life was shattered by a scream and a single gunshot echoing from the underground parking garage. A 911 dispatcher picked up the call someone just got shot in the parking lot. Detective Eric Barnes, a Dallas homicide detective, was on call when the report came in. Heading straight to the crime scene, he found it unsettling. The parking garage was sterile and quiet, far from the rough neighborhoods where he'd spent years investigating violent crime. Uptown. Barnes thought, wasn't the place for this kind of violence. For Skip Hollinsworth, a journalist with Texas Monthly, it was a world of contradictions. This is the last place you'd expect to find a murder victim in a parking garage, he would later say. It's just not that kind of place. When Barnes arrived at the scene, he learned the victim was Kendra Hatcher, a pediatric dentist who had recently moved to Dallas for work. Known as a bright spirit and all-American beauty, Kendra had been a cheerleading captain, a devout Christian, and a loving yoga instructor. Her murder shocked everyone who knew her. Barnes and his team quickly located surveillance footage from the parking garage. Though grainy, the footage revealed a suspicious vehicle, a dark Jeep Cherokee, that had entered the garage just moments before Kendra arrived. The driver had circled her parking spot before stopping, and within seconds of Kendra stepping out of her car, a man emerged from the back of the Jeep, approached her, and fired. To identify the shooter, the Dallas Police Department released an urgent statement, appealing to the public for help in finding the vehicle and any possible witnesses. Soon after, Dr. Ricardo Paniagua, Kendra's boyfriend, came forward, shaken. Reviewing the surveillance footage with detectives, he noted a chilling connection the person seen with the Jeep reminded him of his ex-girlfriend, Brenda Delgado. Ricardo explained that he and Brenda had dated for years and even lived together before parting ways. She hadn't taken the breakup well, particularly after he began dating Kendra. The situation took a turn when a mechanic contacted the tip line, reporting he was the owner of the Jeep Cherokee captured on camera. He mentioned that Brenda had borrowed his Jeep, as her own car had been in the shop for repairs. Investigators were zeroing in on Brenda Delgado. She'd come to Dallas from Mexico, a factory worker's daughter with a dream of a better life. She couldn't afford college, so she trained to become a dental hygienist and attended an evangelical church. To her friends and family, Brenda was loyal and reserved, a quiet presence. Yet Detective Barnes was tasked with confronting her. When Brenda walked into the interview room, she appeared calm, her demeanor unfazed by the murder investigation swirling around her. "I'm working a murder investigation," Barnes told her directly. "A young woman was killed on Wednesday, and your name has come up in the investigation." With every word, the line between devoted friend and cold-hearted conspirator blurred, sending chills through a city unaccustomed to this level of darkness in its heart. The case was only beginning. But the layers of obsession, jealousy, and betrayal would soon unfold, revealing a story far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Detective Eric Barnes was face-to-face with Brenda Delgado, trying to peel back the layers of her connection to a crime that had rocked Dallas. But something about her demeanor felt off. While most people in her position would be anxious, defensive, and guarded, Brenda was anything but. She was relaxed, friendly, even chatty, trying to find common ground with the detective. It was almost as if she was trying to charm him, striking up a conversation about faith and mentioning her ties to an organization that Barnes himself was part of. It wasn't the behavior he expected from a potential suspect in a murder case. As their conversation continued, Brenda claimed she knew about the murder only from what she'd seen in the news. She denied knowing the victim, Kendra Hatcher, or anything about Kendra's personal life. She provided a solid alibi, claiming she'd spent the day studying for her dental technician's license at the library with a friend and later went to a Chili's restaurant. She even had the receipt, neatly folded and ready to hand over, proving she had closed her tab at 8:57 p.m. It was a bit too perfect. But as the interview went on, Brenda casually mentioned someone else who could be of interest to a friend named Crystal. Crystal, she said, had borrowed a Jeep Cherokee from her mechanic friend to drive her to the library that day. Brenda handed over Crystal's name and phone number without hesitation, as if it were just another small favor. Meanwhile, Crystal Cortez sat in another interrogation room down the hall, facing her own questions. Crystal's story was a whirlwind of contradictions. At first, she spun a tale of a masked man who allegedly forced her to participate in the crime, holding a gun to her head while her young son sat in the back seat. It was a chaotic story, more fitting for a movie script than a real-life crime scene. Detective Barnes wasn't buying it. Surveillance footage revealed no signs of panic from Crystal. She had parked the car, waited calmly while the gunman exited, and made no attempt to flee the scene afterward. Pushed by Barnes, her story shifted again. She finally admitted that Brenda had hired her, offering $500 in drugs as payment to help stage a robbery targeting Kendra Hatcher's purse and ID. At this revelation, Barnes knew he was looking at a murder-for-hire plot. Armed with Crystal's admission, Barnes headed back to Brenda, this time with a stronger case. He confronted her, making it clear he knew about her arrangement with Crystal, but Brenda's calm facades didn't crack. She denied any agreement and insisted it was all coincidence, just an unfortunate series of events. Would you say it's a big coincidence that your ex-boyfriend's girlfriend ends up dead and your friend ends up driving in the same parking lot at the same time, in a Jeep you borrowed? Barnes pressed. Brenda's silence was telling. She had no answer for that, but her silence spoke volumes. And with that, Detective Barnes had the final pieces he needed. What had started as a shocking and senseless murder in an upscale neighborhood was now exposed as a sinister web of jealousy, manipulation, and betrayal, sealing Brenda Delgado's fate and uncovering the truth behind the crime that had shaken Dallas. Detective Eric Barnes was done playing nice. Brenda Delgado sat across from him, calm and composed, despite the fact that everything about the case seemed to point back to her. But her act of innocence had worn thin. Patiently, he laid it out. Crystal Cortez, Brenda's friend, had driven the Jeep. The victim was Brenda's ex-boyfriend's new girlfriend. Every thread in this tragic web connected back to her. Yet Brenda continued to insist she had no connection to the murder, no motive. "I didn't even know who she was," she claimed. But Barnes wasn't buying it. He knew from her ex, Dr. Ricardo Paniagua, that Brenda had shown up in odd places, like his salsa classes and jogging routes, well after they'd broken up. She'd been watching him, even tracking his new relationship with Kendra Hatcher. Detective Barnes pushed harder. "You had plenty of motive," he told her. "You hated not being good enough for him." When her defenses began to crumble, Brenda asked for her attorney. And that was it. Without enough to charge her, Barnes and his team could hold her only briefly, within 48 hours of her release. Brenda fled to Mexico. The case shifted dramatically when the FBI stepped in, adding Brenda Delgado to their 10 most wanted list, offering a $100,000 reward for her capture. She had become one of the few women ever to make the notorious list. And Barnes' team now focused on uncovering the identity of the gunman. A common phone number in both Brenda's and Crystal's phone records led detectives to a man named Christopher Love, known to police as a small-time marijuana dealer. In the interrogation room, Love was defiant. "I ain't shot nobody," he insisted, denying any involvement. But a critical clue changed everything. An ATF dog, Titan, was brought in to sniff for weapons and led investigators straight to a hidden gun under the console in Love's car. With this evidence in hand, detectives were sure they'd found their shooter. With Love's arrest, the investigation was closing in on its core players. Brenda Delgado was the mastermind, hiring Love and Crystal Cortez in a twisted plot driven by jealousy. She had watched her ex-boyfriend move on, tracking his every move, even knowing he and Kendra were about to leave for a romantic trip to Cancun. As she descended into a dark obsession, she enlisted Love and Crystal to kill Kendra, offering Love drugs and promises of a lifetime supply. The day before their trip, Kendra Hatcher was gunned down, all to prevent her from joining Ricardo on that flight. As Love was led away to jail, he had one last question for Detective Barnes. "You gonna get Brenda?" Barnes assured him they would. And they did. After months on the run, Brenda was apprehended in Mexico and extradited to face justice in Texas. This crime, driven by jealousy and obsession, brought 3 lives crashing down and left a scar on an upscale Dallas community that would not be soon forgotten. Christopher Love was entranced by the idea of becoming Dallas's next drug kingpin. But now, facing a murder charge, he rejected a deal to testify against Brenda Delgado, his alleged accomplice, preferring to go down on his own terms. Meanwhile, Crystal Cortez, who had driven the getaway car, accepted a plea deal for 35 years and became the prosecution's star witness. She recounted chilling details of the plan, which had included options like injecting the victim with a needle, shooting her, or kidnapping her. Love, she testified, opted for the simplest method, a gun. During the trial, Cortez's testimony brought everything together. She admitted that for $500 arranged as bills shaped into a heart, she had assisted Love in murdering Kendra Hatcher, her former friend and rival. When Detective Barnes asked why she agreed to such a horrific act for such a low sum, her response was haunting. "You don't know what it means to be broke." The defense's cross-examination was ruthless, painting Cortez as a self-serving liar, desperate to save herself. But her calm insistence on the facts proved powerful. She revealed how Brenda, seething with jealousy, had plotted to eliminate Kendra. Fueled by her obsession with her ex-boyfriend, Dr. Ricardo Paniagua, Brenda's jealousy had driven her to extreme measures, stalking Kendra and planning her murder. After just 3 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Love of capital murder, sentencing him to death. But the case wasn't closed. Brenda Delgado had fled to Mexico after her initial interrogation, prompting the FBI to place her on the 10 most wanted list, with a $100,000 reward. Tips eventually led detectives to a small town in Mexico, where she was arrested and extradited to face trial in Texas. In court, Brenda, appearing studious and harmless in glasses, pleaded not guilty. Her lawyer argued that Cortez, not Brenda, was the true mastermind behind a robbery gone wrong. But the prosecution presented damning evidence, including testimonies from Brenda's cousin and roommate, who revealed her prior attempts to solicit attacks on Kendra and even Ricardo. As the trial reached its climax, Ricardo took the stand, recalling how Brenda had turned up unexpectedly at places he frequented, unaware of her growing jealousy. Crystal's final testimony depicted the harrowing moment Kendra was murdered. The prosecution painted a tragic picture of a life cut short by jealousy and obsession. In the end, the jury had seen through Brenda's quiet demeanor, concluding that her desire for revenge was unmistakable. As she was led away, the once seemingly innocent woman who had masterminded such a vicious plot was finally held accountable. The case, which began with a love triangle and ended in tragedy, left an indelible mark on Dallas, serving as a reminder of the devastating consequences of jealousy and betrayal. Inside Room 2 at the Dallas Police Headquarters, Brenda Delgado sat across from detectives, meticulously applying makeup as though preparing for something other than a murder investigation. Her calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the gravity of the accusations against her. Detectives were nearing the end of a grueling 2-hour interview, and Detective Barnes, one of the lead investigators, watched her intently. At times, he met her gaze, silently conveying that while she may have deceived others, she hadn't fooled him. In the courtroom, Brenda's defense team chose not to call her to testify, claiming that she was an innocent woman caught in a deadly trap set by her accomplice, Crystal Cortez. But questions lingered. If Brenda was innocent, why did she flee to Mexico and spend 6 months evading the law? The prosecutors saw it differently. They argued that her departure and life on the run only underscored her guilt. Kendra Hatcher, her former romantic rival, had fallen victim to Brenda's jealous obsession, a brutal fate that didn't need to happen. In closing arguments, the prosecution reminded the jury of the love triangle Brenda had conjured in her mind, a triangle that only existed because of her own bitter obsession. The prosecutor declared that while Kendra Hatcher was now home, it was in a casket, a place she never should have ended up. "Your message to this woman," he urged, needs to be that she will never go home again. The defense insisted there was reasonable doubt, painting Cortez as a manipulative liar who concocted the plot herself. But the jury quickly reached a consensus, deliberating for only 20 minutes before convicting Brenda of capital murder. Since Brenda's extradition agreement from Mexico forbade the death penalty, she was sentenced to life in prison. After the verdict, Kendra's family took the stand to express their grief. Her sister spoke about the devastation Brenda had brought upon their family. "You stole a sister, a friend, a godmother, and you've left a wound that will never heal." Brenda was taken away, sentenced to spend the rest of her life behind bars, a fate she had earned through her own jealousy and envy, her life forever confined to the steel walls that now enclosed her. When 13-year-old Dylan Redwine vanished during a court-ordered visit to his father's home in Durango, Colorado, the case quickly unraveled into a tangled web of family suspicion, accusations, and unsettling discoveries. As search efforts mounted, Dylan's mother, Elaine, and brother, Corey, publicly confronted Dylan's father, Mark Redwine, who was the last person to see him alive. The tension between Mark and Elaine intensified as Mark pointed fingers at Elaine, suggesting she might have been involved in Dylan's disappearance, though he offered no solid basis for his accusations. Dylan had traveled to see his father reluctantly, preferring to spend Thanksgiving with his terminally ill grandmother. Court orders, however, left his mother little choice but to send him. Witnesses noticed that the father and son's reunion was tense. There were no smiles, no embraces. Surveillance footage showed them walking separately through a Walmart, where Dylan bought DVDs, seemingly more focused on texting friends than engaging with his father. After that, Dylan was last seen alive leaving Walmart with Mark, stopping for a quick meal, and then heading back to Mark's house. Later that night, at 9:46 p.m., Dylan's phone went silent. Days turned into weeks without any sign of Dylan, and his mother and brother took to protesting outside Mark's home, demanding answers. They believed he was hiding something, and their suspicions only deepened after he failed a polygraph test, particularly on the question of whether he knew Dylan's whereabouts. As the investigation progressed, shocking information surfaced. Corey revealed that during a family trip, Dylan had discovered explicit photos on Mark's laptop showing his father dressed in women's clothing and engaged in lewd acts. Corey recalled how Dylan had been horrified and planned to confront Mark about the images, a confrontation that would lead to a blowout argument just before Dylan's disappearance. The shocking images became a pivotal piece of evidence, suggesting a possible motive for Mark to silence his son. Mark, however, publicly dismissed the photos as staged, alleging that they were part of an elaborate scheme to frame him. The case took a national spotlight when the Redwine family appeared on Dr. Phil. There, Elaine and Corey confronted Mark, with Corey accusing him outright of killing Dylan. Mark's erratic behavior and strained denials only fueled public suspicion. The show led to hundreds of tips, but none provided the answers that the family desperately sought. The following spring, after the snow thawed in the rugged Colorado mountains, search teams turned their focus to Middle Mountain, an area Mark had been spotted near shortly after Dylan's disappearance. It was there, during an intense 4-day search involving dog handlers, horseback teams, and even rappellers, that investigators found a Nike Air Jordan shoe, followed by human remains. DNA testing confirmed that the bones belonged to Dylan Redwine. The discovery shattered any remaining hope and brought the case back to Mark Redwine. Investigators believed that the father-son conflict and the damning photos had led to a tragic end for Dylan. Finally, in 2020, years after Dylan's disappearance, Mark Redwine was arrested and charged with his son's murder, marking the end of a long, agonizing journey for Dylan's family. It was a tense moment when investigator Tanya called Mark Redwine about his missing son, Dylan. The exchange began with Tanya questioning Mark's demeanor, noticing he sounded strangely upbeat, almost like he was living the dream. When she asked if he was intoxicated, he denied it, brushing her off with sarcastic remarks. But the most chilling part came when he criticized her, saying she couldn't see beyond the surface. Mark also made disturbing comments about women, revealing a deep-seated anger and distrust. His resentment toward Elaine, Dylan's mother had been simmering for years, with accusations flying back and forth about who was responsible for Dylan's disappearance. As the investigation continued, one of Mark's slip-ups involved a fishing pole he claimed to have found in his garage, despite the fact that police had already searched and photographed the area thoroughly. The fishing pole had been part of a narrative Mark initially used, suggesting Dylan had gone fishing alone, but its sudden discovery only deepened the investigators' suspicion that Mark was manipulating evidence. Nearly 3 years after Dylan's disappearance, hikers on Middle Mountain found a skull a mile from where other bones had previously been discovered. When investigators confirmed it was Dylan's, his mother, Elaine, felt both heartbreak and relief, hoping this would finally lead to justice. However, the case stalled again until 2017 when a new district attorney, Christian Champagne, reopened the investigation. Determined to seek justice, Champagne convened a grand jury, which ultimately indicted Mark for second-degree murder and child abuse resulting in death. The news reached Mark while he was working as a trucker in Washington state, catching him off guard. He seemed confident that the authorities didn't have enough evidence to indict him until now. When Mark Redwine stood trial, the prosecution had to prove that he had a motive and that the crime wasn't premeditated. Elaine took the stand, sharing memories of her son. Dylan, she recounted, was sweet, funny, and deeply empathetic. She also described the heart-wrenching moments of texting him with no reply, her growing fear becoming a reality she couldn't escape. During cross-examination, the defense tried to undermine her credibility, suggesting her grief had driven her to publicly accuse Mark without evidence. But the jury was unmoved by these tactics, seeing a mother fighting for the truth about her son's fate. The trial turned grim when the prosecution introduced graphic photos found on Mark's computer, which had driven a wedge between father and son. Dylan had stumbled upon these pictures, showing Mark dressed in women's clothing, wearing a diaper, and engaging in unspeakable acts. When Dylan showed his brother Corey, both were disgusted, and Dylan later threatened to confront Mark with the photos. Prosecutors argued that this confrontation led to a violent argument, triggering Mark to lash out at his son. But the jury needed hard evidence. To bring the case to life, the prosecution recreated Mark's living room in the courtroom. Jurors walked through a meticulous setup, viewing the very furniture where bloodstains confirmed as Dylan's were found on the couch, floor, and coffee table. However, the defense claimed these could have been accidental or unrelated to the night in question, casting doubt on whether they proved a violent struggle. Ultimately, the jury was presented with a picture of anger, shame, and resentment that had festered between Mark and Dylan. Though the exact sequence of events remained elusive, the cumulative evidence pointed to a tragic conclusion. After years of delay, accusations, and painstaking investigation, justice was finally on the horizon. As the trial of Mark Redwine approached its conclusion, the focus turned to the most harrowing question: who or what was responsible for the death of 13-year-old Dylan Redwine? The prosecution believed Dylan's skull bore signs of blunt force trauma, implying violence. But the defense seized on the setting where his remains had been found, remote wilderness populated by bears and mountain lions. They pointed to puncture marks on the skull, arguing that these injuries could easily have come from an animal's teeth or claws. Defense witnesses testified that it was possible for a bear or mountain lion to have carried Dylan's skull the mile-long distance from the rest of his remains. However, as the prosecution argued, it defied logic that Dylan, dressed only in shorts and a t-shirt, would wander into such dangerous terrain alone in the freezing November weather. The story, according to the prosecutors, simply didn't add up. Throughout the trial, all eyes were on Mark Redwine. The jury scrutinized his reactions as witnesses recounted the discovery of Dylan's remains, the tension in their relationship, and the disturbing photos that had come between them. But unlike a grieving father, Mark remained stone-faced. Not a single tear was shed. Mark ultimately declined to testify in his own defense, leaving the jury to weigh the evidence without his side of the story. In closing arguments, the prosecution painted a tragic picture of father-son relationship eroded by anger and betrayal. They claimed that Dylan had uncovered shocking photos on Mark's computer, and had been deeply upset. They argued that the conflict over these photos led to a violent confrontation, one that ended with Dylan's life. The defense, however, stood firm, arguing that the case was riddled with assumptions. They criticized the prosecution's focus on the incriminating photos, calling it a distraction from the lack of concrete, physical evidence. This case, they insisted, was built on a narrative of anger and photos, not on science. After 5 weeks of trial, the jury returned its verdict in a mere 6 hours. When the judge read the decision, Mark stood impassive as he was declared guilty of both second-degree murder and child abuse. A sob from Dylan's mother, Elaine, broke the silence in the courtroom. She had fought tirelessly to see justice done, even as Mark's defense team questioned her motives and her pain. In a tearful statement, she addressed the court, her voice trembling. Dylan looked up at his father, knowing he was the killer... but now we're free from you. Elaine's words were echoed by the sentencing judge, who condemned Mark's utter lack of remorse. Mark himself maintained his innocence in a statement to the probation office, calling his conviction a miscarriage of justice and the trial a sham, but the judge remained unmoved, sentencing him to 48 years in prison. For Dylan's family, the sentence brought some measure of resolution, but never true closure. Elaine knew she would always grieve for her son, but she hoped that by pursuing justice, she had sent a message to others in her position. Keep fighting, she said. Never give up in her heart. She would always carry Dylan's memory, his courage, and the tragic end that had finally, after so many years, brought a kind of peace